Okay, so are you ready to wade into some pretty murky legal waters today?
Always up for a challenge.
All right, good, because the question on everyone's mind is whether there's any way to challenge Trump's 2024 win.
Right, given everything that happened.
Exactly, given his role in January 6th and the fact that Colorado actually barred him from their ballot.
Yeah, that was unprecedented.
It really was. So we're going to explore a long shot, but we're going to explore whether a citizen's class action lawsuit using the 14th Amendment could potentially work.
It's a fascinating question, especially considering that the Supreme Court already weighed in on this before the election.
And their decision was a bit of a head-scratcher for a lot of people.
It surprised a lot of folks, so to really understand where we are now, we need to rewind back to January 6th.
Back to the Capitol.
Right, and recap what happened, because this wasn't just protest.
It was a full-blown attack.
An attack aimed at stopping the certification of the election results.
With violence and injuries to police officers.
Absolutely. And the intimidation tactics used against lawmakers, it all pointed to a very deliberate attempt to overturn the election.
Even some conservative legal scholars have argued that it meets the definition of an insurrection.
Yeah, folks like William Baude and Michael Stokes Paulson.
And that word insurrection is key here.
It is the key because it ties directly into Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
Which was originally intended to prevent former Confederates from holding office after the Civil War.
Right.
And states that anyone who has taken an oath to support the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection is disqualified from holding office.
Exactly, and that's where things get really tricky.
Because the Colorado Supreme Court actually agreed that Trump's actions on January 6th constituted engaging in insurrection.
They did, and barred him from appearing on their ballot.
Which was a first.
The first time a presidential candidate had ever been disqualified from a state ballot because of the 14th Amendment.
So for a moment, it seemed like this section might actually have some teeth.
Right, but then the Supreme Court stepped in, and here's where the plot thickens in a unanimous decision. They overturned the Colorado ruling. And this is a big, but they didn't rule on whether January 6th was an insurrection.
All right, what?
Or whether Trump was personally involved.
So how did they justify overturning Colorado's decision?
Their decision hinged on a technicality. They essentially said that states don't have the power to enforce Section 3 against federal candidates.
So they basically sidestepped the big question.
They did the question of whether Trump's actions meet the definition of insurrection.
And focused on who has the authority to enforce this part of the 14th Amendment.
Precisely. And that's what makes the possibility of a citizen's class action lawsuit so interesting.
Because even though the Supreme Court blocked states from disqualifying Trump before the election.
Right. They didn't rule out the possibility of Congress doing so after the election.
Even now that he's won.
Exactly.
So a class action lawsuit wouldn't be trying to directly overturn the election results.
No.
But rather to pressure Congress into taking action.
Exactly. It would be about highlighting the evidence and arguing that Congress has a constitutional duty to enforce Section 3.
And you said there's another twist.
Oh, yeah. While the Supreme Court was unanimous in their decision, 4 of the conservative justices actually wanted to go even further.
Okay, I knew there was another twist coming.
They argued that any action to disqualify Trump under Section 3 would require a full act of Congress.
So they were basically trying to give him even more protection.
Essentially, yes. Even in their agreement, there's disagreement about how far this protection should extend.
So we've got a complicated legal landscape here.
We do.
We've got the Supreme Court saying states can't enforce Section 3 against federal candidates.
Right.
But leaving the door open for Congress to act. And we've got disagreement even among the justices about how much leeway Congress should have.
All of this is happening against the backdrop of a deeply divided Congress.
Of course, with many Republicans still firmly in Trump's camp.
Right.
This definitely sets the stage for a fascinating legal battle.
It does.
But before we jump into the potential arguments for and against a class action lawsuit,
Okay.
let's unpack this 14th Amendment a bit more. Just how potent is Section 3?
Yeah.
Has it ever been successfully used to disqualify someone from office before?
Well, Section 3 has a pretty fascinating history. It was added to the Constitution in the wake of the Civil War.
Right, to address the aftermath.
And its primary aim was to prevent former Confederate leaders from regaining political power.
To keep them out of office.
Right. It was a way to ensure that those who had rebelled against the United States couldn't just slip back into positions of authority.
So it was a pretty radical measure for its time.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it worked.
It did to a significant degree.
Did it actually prevent former Confederates from holding office?
There were numerous cases where individuals were barred from holding office because of their roles in the Confederacy.
Wow.
It was a powerful tool for Reconstruction and for reshaping the political landscape of the South.
Okay, so how does that history relate to Trump and the current situation? I mean, it's been over 150 years since the Civil War.
Right.
Are there any real parallels?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Some legal scholars argue that the parallels are striking.
Interesting.
They point out that the core principle behind Section 3 is about protecting the government from those who have sought to overthrow it.
Okay.
Whether it's a Confederate general in 1868 or a sitting president in 2024, the argument is that the threat to democracy is the same.
So they're saying that the specific historical context doesn't matter
Right.
as much as the underlying principle of safeguarding the government.
Exactly, safeguarding the government from those who've tried to destroy it.
But isn't there a danger in applying a Civil War-era amendment to a 21st century political situation?
Of course, that's a concern.
Like, couldn't this open the door for partisan abuse, with Congress potentially trying to disqualify any president they disagree with?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern.
Yeah.
And it's one that even some supporters of Section 3 acknowledge.
So it's not a simple issue.
Not at all. It raises a whole host of questions about the balance of power, the role of Congress, and the potential for politically motivated actions.
And it also makes you wonder how we even define insurrection in a modern context.
Yeah.
I mean, what might have seemed like a clear-cut rebellion in 1865 could be much more ambiguous today.
Especially in a world of social media and online organizing.
Exactly.
You're hitting on a crucial point. The definition of insurrection is central to this whole debate. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court's decision to focus on procedure rather than substance leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions.
We're in uncharted territory here.
We are.
We have this powerful tool in the Constitution, Section 3,
Right.
but we're still grappling with how to apply it in a way that both protects democracy and safeguards against abuse.
And that's what makes this potential class action lawsuit so important.
Okay.
It could force a much-needed public debate about these fundamental questions.
So let's talk about this lawsuit for a minute. What would it actually look like? Who would be involved and what arguments would they make?
It would likely be a group of citizens represented by legal experts who would file the suit.
Okay.
Their main argument would be that Congress has a constitutional duty to investigate Trump's actions
Right.
and determine whether they meet the definition of engaging in insurrection under Section 3.
And what evidence would they present?
Well,
We know the Colorado court heard extensive testimony about Trump's role in the January 6th attack,
right.
but would that be enough to convince Congress?
They would likely build on the Colorado case using the evidence presented there as a starting point.
Okay.
They would also likely bring in additional evidence,
Like what?
including expert testimony on the definition of insurrection analysis of Trump's statements and actions leading up to January 6th, and perhaps even testimony from former administration officials.
So they'd need to make a very strong case.
Very strong, especially given the political climate in Congress.
Right. But let's say, hypothetically, that they do manage to convince a majority of lawmakers. What happens then? Could Congress actually remove Trump from office?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
There's no clear precedent for removing a president who has already been elected and sworn in.
I see.
Some legal scholars believe that Congress could initiate impeachment proceedings, while others argue that a separate mechanism would need to be created.
So there's a lot of uncertainty about the process,
A lot.
which makes the whole thing even more precarious.
Absolutely. This would be uncharted territory.
Yeah.
And there would be major legal and political battles every step of the way.
And we haven't even touched on the public reaction. Can you imagine the backlash?
Oh, yeah.
If Congress actually tried to remove a duly elected president, especially one as polarizing as Trump.
It would undoubtedly trigger a massive political earthquake.
Wow.
There would be accusations of a coup, claims of partisan warfare, and who knows what else.
You're not kidding.
It would be a defining moment for American democracy, and the fallout would be impossible to predict.
So even if this class action lawsuit gains traction? Yeah.
Even if it succeeds in convincing Congress to take action, the battle would be far from over.
That's right. And that's why this whole situation is so fascinating. It's not just a legal question, it's a political question, a social question, and ultimately a question about the very soul of America.
It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about our system.
Yeah.
about the vulnerabilities of our system, the potential for abuse, and the fragility of our democratic institutions.
And it reminds us that the fight for democracy is never truly over.
Right.
It's an ongoing process, a constant struggle to uphold our values and protect the principles upon which this nation was founded.
We've talked about the history of Section 3, the potential arguments in a class action lawsuit, and the political complexities of any attempt to remove Trump from office.
We have.
But we haven't really delved into the heart of the matter, the evidence itself of what did Trump actually do that could be considered engaging in insurrection?
That's a question that deserves its own deep dive.
It does.
And that's exactly what we'll do in part 3 of this episode. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the history of the 14th Amendment to the potential legal pathways.
All those twists and turns.
Exactly. But let's get down to brass tacks here. What specific evidence is there that Trump engaged in insurrection under Section 3?
Well, the Colorado trial really laid it all out. They presented a compelling narrative of Trump's actions.
Leading up to January 6th.
And during the attack, they had firsthand accounts from police officers who defended the Capitol lawmakers who were trapped inside, and even some of the rioters themselves.
I can only imagine those testimonies were pretty chilling.
Oh, they were. What kind of picture did they paint of Trump's involvement?
Yeah, what did they say?
They described a president who, for weeks, had been pushing this narrative of a stolen election.
Even though there was no evidence?
Right. Despite having no evidence, he repeatedly pressured state officials to overturn the results.
And when that failed, he turned his attention to Congress.
Exactly. He was urging his supporters to fight like hell to stop the certification process.
And then on January 6th, he held that rally near the White House,
Right.
where he told the crowd to march to the Capitol.
Exactly. And the court really dug into that speech, analyzing every phrase, every intonation to figure out if it was inciting violence.
Did they look at anything else?
Oh, yeah. They also scrutinized his actions during the attack itself.
Like what?
Particularly his delay in calling off the mob and his initial praise for the rioters, even as they were breaking into the Capitol.
It sounds like they were really trying to draw a direct line between Trump's words and the violence.
They were, and they ultimately concluded that he did engage in insurrection.
Wow.
They argued that his actions and statements directly led to the attack on the Capitol.
And they had a lot of evidence to back that up.
Mountains of it, from his tweets and speeches to his behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
But the Supreme Court never actually ruled on whether January 6th was an insurrection.
Right. They focused on the states' rights issue.
So does that mean all the evidence from Colorado is irrelevant now?
Not necessarily, while the Supreme Court's ruling might have prevented Colorado from disqualifying Trump.
Okay.
It doesn't erase the evidence they gathered that evidence could be crucial in a potential class action lawsuit.
So a citizens group could use the Colorado trial as a blueprint.
Exactly. They could build on that foundation to present an even stronger case to Congress.
It sounds like a long shot.
It is a monumental task, especially given the political obstacles.
Right. But let's say hypothetically that they do convince Congress that Trump engaged in insurrection.
Okay, what happens then?
What could they actually do?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Because
The Constitution doesn't lay out a clear process for removing a president who's already been elected and sworn in. Especially under these circumstances, it would be up to Congress to figure out how to proceed, which could lead to all sorts of legal and political wrangling.
it sounds messy.
It would be a messy, contentious process with no guarantee of success.
And even if they did manage to remove Trump,
Right.
the ramifications would be huge.
Enormous. We'd be talking about a constitutional crisis unlike anything we've ever seen.
So much to think about. Well, I think this deep dive has highlighted some crucial points.
Yeah.
The 14th Amendment, specifically Section 3, is a powerful tool that could potentially be used to address unprecedented situations like this.
And the evidence presented in the Colorado trial, while not definitive, lays out a pretty compelling case that Trump's actions meet the definition of engaging in insurrection.
And we've learned that the path forward, whether through a class action lawsuit or some other mechanism, is full of uncertainty and would require a ton of political will and legal maneuvering.
It really underscores that our democracy is a work in progress.
It does.
A system that requires constant vigilance and a willingness to confront even the most difficult challenges.
Absolutely. This situation, with all its complexities and potential consequences, forces us to ask some fundamental questions about, accountability, the rule of law, and the future of our nation.
What happens next is anyone's guess, but this deep dive has given you the knowledge you need to understand the stakes of this battle and to engage in informed discussions about the future of American democracy.
Exactly. And we encourage you to keep digging Keep learning and stay engaged because the future of our democracy depends on it.